On October 28, 2025, silence blanketed the Caribbean Sea. Suddenly, the USS Jason Dunham's AN/SPY-1A radar lit up. A faint signal was approaching rapidly from the north. The reflected image was unmistakable. Two F-16A Block 15s relics of the 1980s, part of Venezuela's aging fighter squadron, now accelerating to 540 knots toward the destroyer. Without answering any radio hails or issuing a warning, the two Cold War-era jets fired a pair of AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles directly at the USS Jason Dunham, a destroyer equipped with over 90 missiles and layered radar defenses. This was no mere encounter. It was a direct assault on a U.S. Navy warship patrolling vital oil routes that fuel half the hemisphere. Immediately, the United States deployed two F/A-18E Super Hornets roaring into the fight. Could Venezuela's outdated F-16s possibly destroy a U.S. warship armed with some of the most advanced interception systems on Earth? Or would their reckless strike unleash a swift and devastating counterattack? Let's uncover the truth. "4:37 a.m., October 28, 2025. 20 nautical miles southeast of Curaçao, Caribbean Sea. The sea was calm. The USS Jason Dunham DDG-109, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, moved steadily through international waters, guarding one of the busiest oil shipping routes on Earth, a corridor that carried nearly 4.8 million barrels of crude per day between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. For the ship's 317 sailors, it was supposed to be just another routine patrol. Nothing more. Inside the Combat Information Center, the ship's AN/SPY-1A radar suddenly flared to life. A faint return weak, fragmented low, but it wasn't noise. It was a contact approaching fast from the north. The shape was unmistakable: F-16A, Block 15's relics from the 1980s, part of the 16 aging fighters still operational in Venezuela's Air Force. But these were armed and closing in fast. Fast approach, altitude 4,000 feet, range 35 miles, came the report from CIC. A radio hail was sent. No response. Instead, the two fighters accelerated to 540 knots, flying directly toward the destroyer. This was no drill. It was a message. The bridge did not hesitate. Condition 2. Weapons ready. Battle stations were manned. On deck, sailors locked into position. In the CIC fingers flew across firing controls. Below deck, the Phalanx CIWS spun to life just in case. The F-16s continued to close the gap, slicing through the sky like steel daggers. To attack a U.S. warship in international waters was not an act of defiance. It was an act of suicide. What Venezuela did not know, and was about to learn the hard way, was that the Jason Dunham was not just a ship. It was a floating fortress armed with over 90 missiles-layered radar defenses and a crew trained to react in 0.8 seconds. This was not a flyby. It was a challenge to the United States Navy. 4:49 a.m., 18 nautical miles from USS Jason Dunham. The tension had reached its peak. Radar operators aboard Jason Dunham tracked the two F-16A Block 15s as they split formation, a Cold War tactic reborn. One dove to 1,200 feet above sea level. The other climbed to 8,000 feet, forming a classic pincer attack. Target separation confirmed, Petty Officer Lang reported. Maintain lock, the combat director replied, his tone calm. At 4:50 a.m., the lead Venezuelan pilot fired first. Two AIM-9L Sidewinders vintage heat seekers, designed in 1983, streaked toward the destroyer. Each missile cost no more than $56,000, yet in the wrong hands, they could still spark a billion-dollar crisis. However, their biggest weakness soon became obvious: the AM-9L Hunt's jet exhaust, not steel. Against a warship driven by water-cooled gas turbines venting heat into the sea, the missiles had nothing clean to lock onto. They veered off within seconds, carving chaotic arcs across the sky before slamming harmlessly into the water. The Aegis combat system aboard Jason Dunham had reacted before the crew could even process what happened. 0.8 seconds after launch, detection tracking beams tightened. Within 4 seconds, the RIM 162 ESSM cells were hot, and by the 5th second, the 6-barreled Phalanx CIWS Block 1B thundered to life for 500 rounds per minute, generating a curtain of tungsten that tore through the air. The first F-16 broke hard right to evade its radar warning receiver, screaming. The pilot rolled, nearly skimming the edge of the Phalanx envelope, a streak of fire that marked a lethal line at 600 degrees. The second jet banked aside, preparing for a gun run. Its nose dropped. The M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon began to whine. But SPY-1 on Dunham had already fixed the jet to the inch. The fire control system adjusted elevation, predicting the exact moment it would cross the engagement line. The destroyer still did not fire. Rules of engagement still bound the captain's hand. The Americans recorded every move, every mistake, every hostile breath. On the bridge, the captain's voice cut through the tension. They've fired once, missed twice. They'll get no third chance. And below decks, in that bone-cold moment of precision, the crew knew the next order would not be defend. It would be eliminate. Was this a deliberate strike, or just a reckless move by two pilots testing the limits of American power? 4:55 a.m. Northern Caribbean airspace, altitude 8,000 feet. The silence shattered like glass. From the Combat Information Center, a transmission came through the encrypted line. 3 words, sharp and final: weapons free. Engage hostiles. In that instant, the USS Jason Dunham ceased to be just a ship. It became vengeance in motion. The MK-41 vertical launch system roared open with metallic thunder, unleashing 4 RIM 174 Standard Missile 6 interceptors, each worth about $4.3 million. They climbed at Mach 3.5, slicing through the Caribbean haze like molten spears. Overhead, the commander ordered 2 FA-18T Super Hornets into the fight. At 8,000 feet, the Venezuelan pilots saw the vapor trails too late. Their radar warning receivers screamed red, flooding the cockpits with chaos. They yanked hard on the sticks, desperate to climb, but physics had already taken sides. The first SM-6 struck at about 900 meters. A blossom of tungsten fragments burning hotter than 200 degrees ripped through the F-16's right wing, severing hydraulic lines. The jet spun violently, rolling into a death spiral, trailing black smoke across the dawn sky. Inside, the pilot clawed for the ACES II ejection handle, but the seat was 11 years overdue for deep maintenance. The explosive bolts never fired. His final breath was a scream that vanished beneath the static. The second F-16 tried to fight back. Its AN/ALQ-131 jamming pod, a Cold War antique, spat out false signals, trying to blind the destroyer's radar. But Jason Dunham's SLQ-32 V6 responded with surgical precision, feeding mirrored echoes straight back into the jet's systems. In seconds, the cockpit lights flickered, then died. Power surge system crash. Total failure. Target 2. Losing altitude, reported a sailor. Confirm, splash, replied the captain. Moments later, both radar blips vanished. 2 aircraft, 2 pilots, about $60 million in metal and fuel erased in less than 60 seconds. The ocean swallowed the wreckage, leaving behind only a thin streak of burning oil on the waves. On the bridge, the Phalanx guns powered down. The air still reeked of cordite and salt. No one spoke. There was no triumph, only the grim understanding of what had just occurred. Venezuela had thrown two relics at a superpower. The United States replied with a verdict written in supersonic fire. The sea fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, the kind that follows judgment. Stay with me, because the real war was not fought in the sky. It was about to erupt in diplomacy, oil, and power. 5:30 a.m., Caracas and Washington, D.C. By sunrise, the battle was over, but the aftershocks had only just begun. At 6:00 a.m., Venezuela's state media shattered the quiet with a statement that rippled across Latin America. The United States has violated Venezuelan airspace and destroyed two of our fighter jets. Within minutes, President Nicolas Maduro appeared on national television raising his fist and denouncing the clash as an act of imperial aggression. Caracas filed an emergency appeal to the United Nations Security Council demanding condemnation and reparations. But 2,000 miles north, the Pentagon was already prepared. At 6:31 a.m., the Department of Defense released radar logs, encrypted radio recordings, and thermal imagery captured by the ANSPI-1A system aboard USS Jason Dunham. The evidence was undeniable. Venezuelan jets had approached from international airspace and fired two AIM-90ML missiles first. The U.S. destroyer had retaliated only after detecting those launches. Every frame, every signal, every timestamp was documented. The data hit global media like an explosion. In Washington, senior officials briefed Congress, their tone cold and final. The U.S. Navy immediately reinforced the region. USS Gravely, DDG-107, and USS Porter, DDG-78, departed Norfolk within 4 hours. The carrier USS George H.W. Ipswich, CVN-77, redirected its FA-18E Super Hornet squadrons to patrol the Caribbean air corridor. Satellite coverage expanded, adding 3 Global Hawk drones and 1 P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft for round-the-clock surveillance. The message was unmistakable. The United States was preparing for escalation, but on its own terms. Meanwhile, global markets reacted instantly. Crude oil prices surged 7.8% overnight, and maritime insurers tripled premiums for vessels transiting the Caribbean corridor. Analysts called it the most dangerous standoff in the Western Hemisphere since 1962. Inside the Situation Room, a U.S. admiral summed it up in one sentence. That wasn't an air battle. That was annihilation. And as the world watched two nations inch toward confrontation, the balance of power in the Caribbean shifted quietly and decisively toward the side that still stood unbroken. 8:00 a.m., Roosevelt Roads Naval Base, Puerto Rico. Dawn broke over the Caribbean, but the sky carried a different hue, cold, metallic, disciplined. On the runway at Roosevelt Roads, 10 F-35C Lightning II fighter jets stood in perfect formation, their canopies gleaming under the first light of day. Each aircraft represented $94 million worth of precision and deterrence. Their mission was not to fight. It was to be seen. At 8:05 a.m., one by one, they took off. The thunder of their afterburners rolled across the bay like steel lightning echoing through the sky. Their flight path traced the edge of Venezuelan airspace, a silent warning line drawn through the morning mist. At 25,000 feet, radar signatures painted a message across every defense network in the region. The United States was watching and waiting. Back in Washington, the Department of Defense issued an official statement, read aloud by the Secretary himself. Any hostile action against U.S. forces will be met with an immediate, overwhelming, and decisive response. It was not a threat. It was a law of physics. By noon, USS Gravely and USS Porter had joined USS Jason Dunham. Together, the three destroyers formed a wall of steel sweeping radar every 6 seconds and maintaining a defensive perimeter of over 40 nautical miles. Above them, 3 E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft orbited in a perfect triangle, their radar capable of tracking 2,000 targets simultaneously. No one dared to cross that line again. The international reaction was swift. European allies voiced full support for Washington's stance, while OPEC ministers convened emergency meetings amid fears of disruption to $180 billion worth of annual oil shipping routes. In Caracas, silence replaced outrage. Venezuelan air bases went dark. The country's remaining 14 operational F-16s were grounded indefinitely. As night fell, the Caribbean grew calm again, not with peace, but with order. Waves lapped gently against the hulls of the U.S. destroyers, as if the sea itself acknowledged their authority. There were no victory parades, no grand speeches, only a quiet reaffirmation of dominance. "America does not start wars," the final line of the Pentagon brief read, "but America always ends them." And when the sun rose over the Atlantic, the reflection on those gray hulls told the world everything it needed to know. Deterrence, when forged in discipline, carries more power than any missile ever could. The Caribbean returned to stillness, the kind of quiet that only follows violence. But beneath the calm waves, the consequences rippled far beyond sight. In less than 24 hours, a brief confrontation had rewritten the balance of power across the Western Hemisphere. 2 aircraft lost $60 million in wreckage, and 1 wounded nation forced to face its own limits. Yet, the true cost was measured not in metal, but in credibility. For Venezuela, the clash became a cautionary tale, a moment when pride collided headfirst with reality. It had gambled on defiance, believing that proximity could substitute for power. It learned instead that distance means nothing to precision, and that in modern warfare, arrogance burns faster than fuel. For the United States, it was never about conquest. The Jason Dunham had not sought glory, only to hold the line. The sailors who stood at their stations that day did not cheer when the threat fell. They simply logged the time, sealed the report, and prepared for the next watch. Their discipline was the difference between chaos and order, between a skirmish and a war. By week's end, the headlines had shifted elsewhere. The world moved on. But in military circles, the engagement became a textbook example of escalation control, how one destroyer with restraint and precision stopped a regional crisis before it began. And so the ocean kept its secrets. But one truth lingered above the waterline. Power is not proven by who strikes first, but by who stands unshaken after the smoke clears. The lesson was simple and eternal. The sea remembers, and so does America. Now the question is yours. Was this a battle of strength or a lesson in restraint? Comment your answer below, because the next storm at sea may decide more than ships. It may decide history itself.